For years, Russia's armored power was built on a single idea, that nothing could stop its advance. But on October 27, 2025, in the fog-covered fields of Donetsk, that myth collapsed. What Moscow called the decisive autumn offensive turned into a 6-hour massacre. Armored vehicles destroyed, entire platoons wiped out before they could even see the enemy. Ukraine didn't need visibility, only precision. Today, you'll see how a wall of fog turned Russia's biggest offensive into a perfect trap and exposed just how blindly Putin's army is fighting. The central idea of the attack was simple and direct. Force a rapid breakthrough in the Donetsk sector to open a logistical corridor and secure routes to arm and resupply the front. The operational objectives chosen, Shakove, Volodymyrivka, and Dobropilya, were not random. Shakove is a junction that controls lateral routes. Volodymyrivka dominates heights that allow observation and fire coordination. Dobropilya functions as a logistical hub and a staging point to re-emplace armor and ammunition. Capturing those positions would have meant pushing back the Ukrainian line and creating an exploitation corridor toward deeper axes. Tactically, the Russian command bet on a mix of innovations and risky measures, advances through small gaps instead of compact masses, deployments of support drones and reconnaissance skirmishes to probe defenses, and, above all, an attempt to use weather conditions, fog and smoke, as a way to neutralize Ukrainian optical sensing superiority. The logic was clear: obscure the battlefield to reduce the effectiveness of Ukrainian drones and force defenders to react without visual vectors. The assault force was a blend of main battle tanks and support vectors, approximately 29 armored vehicles in the vanguard, escorted by engineering and recovery teams and backed by artillery points and reconnaissance UAVs. In theory, that composition provided mobility, protection, and fire sustainment. In practice, the reliance on even minimal visibility and on predictable routes made the column completely vulnerable. The heart of the Ukrainian defense was made up of 3 elite units: the 1st National Guard Corps, Azov, and the 33rd and 93rd Mechanized Brigades. Each had a precise role within the plan. Azov operated as the defensive spearhead, rapid reaction infantry fortified in underground positions, equipped with vibration sensors and thermal sights capable of detecting any movement through the fog. The 33rd Brigade, veterans of eastern battles, anchored the northern flank with T-64BV and Leopard 2A4 tanks, acting as a mobile barrier. Meanwhile, the 93rd Kholodny Yar Brigade, famous for its tactical discipline, commanded the rear and the saturation artillery, the arm that would finish the attack. The battlefield had been turned into an engineering masterpiece of controlled destruction. In the weeks leading up to the assault, Ukrainian engineers shaped the terrain like a deadly chessboard. Layered minefields, concrete dragon's teeth, obstacles, and narrow corridors intentionally left open, escape routes that, in reality, funneled targets into intersecting kill zones. Seismic sensors and thermal detectors replaced human eyes, transmitting coordinates directly to the fire control center. It was a trap designed not just to destroy vehicles, but to capture the very logic of Russia's linear advance. When the first Russian armored vehicles entered the sector, the fog did the rest. Without visibility, tanks lost contact with one another, relying only on GPS, which was quickly jammed. With every movement, the ground responded. TM-62 mines detonated, ripping off tracks, turrets were hurled into the air, and retreating vehicles stumbled into the false corridors. There, Azov and the Mechanized Brigades opened fire with Stugna-P and Javelin missiles, synchronized with coordinates sent by FPV drones hovering silently above the fog. But the final blow came from above. Operators from the 93rd Brigade guided the artillery fire from Bodana and M777 155mm systems, adjusting each round with real-time corrections. The strikes were precise enough to hit tanks partially concealed by thermal smoke. When the fog began to lift, the Russians finally saw what they were facing, but it was already too late. The next 6 hours would enter the war reports as a brutal example of how an offensive can self-destruct. At 7:05 in the morning, the first Russian line was already trapped in craters and minefields. By 7:30, the tanks trying to bypass the damaged areas found themselves under crossfire from Ukrainian positions hidden along the slopes of Shakove. Every attempt to advance was met with precision strikes, guided by FPV drones hunting isolated targets through the mist. These drones operated in swarms, with their operators spread among the Ukrainian brigades. FPVs weren't hunting for large targets. They hunted survivors, drivers fleeing their tanks, repair teams trying to recover damaged vehicles, or soldiers taking cover behind wreckage. Ukrainian operators called this process digital harvesting, a real-time hunt that turned any movement into a strike coordinate. The Russian infantry, without air cover and with their communications overloaded, was trapped between indirect fire and kamikaze drones. By around 9 o'clock, the scene was catastrophic. According to aerial observation records, 29 Russian vehicles had been destroyed or neutralized. Another 7 were damaged or abandoned after hitting minefields. None of the strategic objectives, Shakove, Volodymyrivka, or Dobropilya, had been reached. What was left of the Russian units retreated in disarray, under continuous guided artillery fire. The offensive, which Moscow had proudly named the Decisive Autumn, turned into a timed ritual of destruction. Intercepted Russian communications revealed sheer desperation. "We've lost contact with the southern platoon. No air cover, requesting evacuation. The fog is not our ally." I repeat, the fog is not our ally. The footage captured by Ukrainian drones paints the perfect picture of that failure. Columns of burning armor scattered across open fields, overturned hulls, crews abandoning their positions and fleeing on foot. In some videos, you can see vehicles crashing into each other as they tried to escape the indirect fire. Others show Stugna-P missiles hitting partially concealed targets, followed by explosions that lit up the fog with the orange glow of destruction. At the observation posts of the 33rd and 93rd Brigades, the monitoring screens displayed an infernal mosaic, thermal signatures blinking, heat traces fading one by one. The Ukrainian command didn't even need to order a counterattack. The battle had already been won through a combination of sensors, terrain, and patience. When the fog finally lifted around noon, the field revealed the true scale of the defeat: burned out armor, scattered infantry, and no intact line of advance. The so-called decisive offensive had dissolved into smoke, and the landscape of Donetsk looked more like a cemetery of steel than an active front. The destruction of the Shakove offensive was not an isolated case. It fits into a growing pattern of Russian collapses throughout 2025. Poorly coordinated offensives, advances without air cover, and attacks that end in logistical catastrophes. Operations in Avdiivka, Bakhmut, and now Donetsk follow the same script. Brute force thrown against deeply prepared defenses, with no real integration between artillery, infantry, and reconnaissance units. The result is an operational tempo in free fall, where each attempted advance costs more resources than the territory it manages to take. This attrition has exposed an uncomfortable truth within the Russian army itself: a crisis of equipment. Modern armored vehicles, the T-90M and T-80BVM, are being replaced by obsolete models pulled from Soviet-era storage depots. It's estimated that by 2025, more than 40% of the vehicles operating on the Eastern Front are already modernized T-62s or T-55s, incapable of withstanding modern anti-tank missiles. And the shortage doesn't stop at tanks. In Donetsk, many of the vehicles destroyed weren't main battle tanks at all, but BMPs and BTRs improvised as assault tanks, a tactic that exposes Moscow's logistical desperation. The replacement of heavy armor with light troop carriers has become standard practice, and every engagement proves that it comes at an enormous cost in lives. But perhaps the biggest problem doesn't lie in the machines. It lies in the minds that command them. The Russian high command remains trapped in the same doctrine that has failed since the start of the war. While Ukrainian forces have evolved into a distributed command model, where small units make decisions based on real-time data, the Russian army still operates under a slow, hierarchical chain of command that depends on orders from far away. The outcome is predictable: the same tactics, the same mistakes, and the same defeat. In Donetsk, the fog merely accelerated the inevitable: an army trying to fight the present with the ideas of the past. That battle proves something no propaganda can hide. Russia is losing control of its own battlefield. The defeat in Donetsk echoed through Moscow, where silence began to weigh heavier than any explosion at the front. Inside the Kremlin, the collapse of the Shakove offensive was received as a direct political blow. For Putin, fully capturing Donetsk was more than a military objective. It was a symbol of internal victory, a narrative to sustain public support and troop morale. Since the beginning of 2025, state propaganda had been selling the autumn offensive as the strike that would change the course of the war. Instead, it became the visible proof of a deadlock, an exhausted army, a command with no answers, and a leader under pressure to show results. The loss of dozens of armored vehicles and hundreds of men in just a few hours fueled growing tension inside Russia's own power circle, with generals trading blame and the Ministry of Defense avoiding any release of official figures. At the strategic level, analysts are already questioning whether this might have been Russia's last major offensive. Ammunition stockpiles are in free fall, tank replacement has become chaotic, and the country's industrial capacity is crippled by sanctions blocking essential components. Russia's war, once defined by mass and saturation, has now devolved into a struggle for operational survival. Every advance depends more on propaganda than on logistics, and every defeat erodes what little internal confidence remains. On the other hand, this fragility opens a rare window for Ukraine. With Russian lines disorganized and their resources spread thin, Kyiv now has a chance to expand control in the east and consolidate its gains. But every opportunity carries a risk. A cornered enemy is also the most dangerous one. History shows that regimes under pressure tend to react unpredictably, and the Kremlin, cornered and humiliated, still has the means to escalate the war, including through long-range strikes. While Moscow struggles to survive, China just realized that the future has already surrounded it. The United States and its allies are building an invisible wall of missiles across the Pacific, and it's about to completely change the rules of the game. Click now on the video that is appearing on your screen and see how Australia, with new HIMARS systems and precision missiles, is reshaping the balance of military power on the planet. See you there.